Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many of you here on a Monday afternoon. My name is Tom Charity. I'm the year-round programmer here at the VIFF Center. Welcome, thank you for joining us on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Apologies for last week. As you were no doubt informed, our guest speaker, Devin Scott, was taken ill at the last minute. So I'm happy to report he's fit and well today, but go easy on him. We have rearranged a date for the talk that he was unable to deliver last week. So that is now scheduled, and if you don't have a season pass for this series, tickets are now on sale for that. It's in the same time slot, the first Monday after the festival, which is October the 7th. So Devin will be giving his talk on, well, he can talk about it, but on filtration, is that right? I don't know what it is, but we'll find out on October the 7th. And instead of showing three colors blue, because as you may know, we showed three colors blue on Monday without the talk, we are going to show a different Kieslowski film, The Double Life of Veronique, which is very similar vein, but a very different color palette. I will give a little plug. We have an event coming up. The 43rd annual Vancouver International Film Festival runs from the 26th of September to the 6th of October. And if you haven't sorted out your tickets, you should really get on that. This is the guide. This is the printed guide. Obviously, there's a website also. I just want to tell you about one screening in particular. You'll find it on page, I think it's 53, and the film is called Preface to a History, and it is screening on October the 3rd in this very venue at 6:30, and the director of that film is one Devin Scott. That's why. So I thought you should know about that film. I'm not going to eat up more of your time, but I will say Devin's going to talk for about 40 minutes. There will be a little break, 10 minutes intermission, and then we're going to show you Amelie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back among the land of the living. It's one of those horrible things in life where, it was 10 a.m. I was, my temperature is a little high. And so I take my COVID test, first one in a few days, and I get the brightest line I've ever seen in my life. I've never color graded a line this bright. And my first thought was, God damn it, I had a pretty good presentation set today. So come see it on October 7th because I'm pretty happy with it. I hope blue was good. It was a beautiful restoration. The folks, yeah? Oh, good. The folks at MK2 did a great job restoring it. It's the first version ever with proper colors. I'll talk about that in 3 weeks. So just, that's our old schedule, and our new schedule looks like that. It's a little non-linear now. Come on October 7th, and we'll talk about filtration, whatever that means. All right, so let's get the house lights a bit down, actually. Let's go to the presentation one. We'll bring the spotlight down to like 5% and the house lights all the way down so we can get some good color on the screen. Because one of the first tenets of digital color correction is viewing environment. We need to have a nice, clean viewing environment so that our eyes are not offset. As you might notice, does anyone here know what color temperature that spotlight is? Any cinematographers in the house? 3200. 3200. What color temperature is the white point of a laser projector? D65, 6500K. Great. A+ to those students. All right. So we're going to start today by talking about the digital intermediate, which is, in my view, perhaps the single biggest technical innovation to hit filmmaking in about 25 years, or much longer than that, actually. Because the prehistory of the digital intermediate goes well beyond its kind of popular usage in cinema. So let's talk about that. First, what the hell is a digital intermediate? We like what the hell questions in this class. So, as you might know, from our past 3 lectures, films are generally shot on celluloid film, right? At least they have during the time periods of the previous 3 movies we talked about. And we're going to still focus today on films shot on film, because the major difference in what we can call now the digital era isn't necessarily I'm going to raise the microphone 1 second. Isn't necessarily the fact that we are mostly shooting digitally these days. It's that post-production, the part after that, happens digitally. And that long predated widespread digital cinematography. And so let's talk about the old workflow that we used to deal with. We started with a film negative, as you can see there, and you would then take that, you'd make dupes, edit it, etc., etc. Let's not talk about the editing, let's talk about the finishing. You would make a negative cut. That is a version of the negative that has been cut to correspond with the editorial decisions that were made throughout post-production. And then that is then color timed. You take it into a grading theater, and you can generally do 1 of 3 things. You can add red, you can add green, or twist, you can add blue. And then you make an interpositive from that session. You then, another generation remove, make an internegative, and then you make a release print from that. So a release print is generally about 4 or more generations of copying removed from the original. Now this has a few implications, right? First implication is that you're making a copy of a copy of a copy. Release prints are generally, all things considered, somewhat grainy, somewhat fuzzy. And because you're basically, every single time you go through a generation copy, you lose what we might call quality, to be reductive. The second thing is that you are locked into to essentially the chemistry of the photochemical process, which basically means that your film, the look of the film, so to speak, is essentially dictated from the moment you're on set. It is a non-arbitrary thing. If you shoot on a certain film stock and you project on a certain film stock, you use a certain lab, your film is always going to look like that unless you do that little top path there, a digital intermediate, which basically involves, first, I'm not going to use a laser pointer because I'm turning away from the microphone. You start by, you shoot on film, and then immediately you scan that negative. You can scan that in full resolution after editing or before editing. You can scan everything you shoot or just the final finished product of the film. There are different ways to do this. This is just one signal path as an example. You then color grade and conform that digitally, right? You use software, and you're going to see some later, to manipulate the look of the film. And then you, in the old DI process, record that back to film. You print that to film. You do what's called a film out. And then that is then, cycled through an internegative and then a release print. So essentially, you're cutting out a few generations there, but you're adding this digital step that essentially abstracts your film. You can do almost anything with that film stock if you've basically collected the data with that film stock. And we're going to see a few iterations of that today. Let's talk about a little brief history of the DI. Early DIs, digital intermediates, were often used for television ads and commercials. But the first feature film ever given a digital intermediate, does anyone actually know what that is? Yeah.
Was it Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Sort of, but not really. It's a long story. The answer is, shockingly, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The first film ever given a high-resolution digital intermediate back in 1993 as a part of a restoration effort. Let's see if I can successfully click on that. There we go.
In 1993, Disney found a way to do it better in partnership with a Kodak division known as Cineon. The restored 1987 film element was imported into the computer, and each of the tens of thousands of frames was cleaned and refurbished.
We ended up giving ourselves 6 months to restore the entire 118,000 frames. And that's what happened, and ultimately ended up being a incredible process that generated much more than we ever anticipated.
So, so this by no means was the very first element of a film given a digital intermediate. During especially the 1980s, you had individual effects shots in films scanned digitally and then printed back onto that kind of larger photochemical finish. A famous example of this is Jurassic Park, where if you watch the 4K Blu-ray of it, you'll notice that every shot featuring a dinosaur is a lot more pixelated, because that's a early 1990s scan, and then the rest is all scanned many decades later. So it's an interesting Frankenstein of a thing.
That's better.
We can see one such example that I want to highlight here, and this is from Schindler's List. And so that's a short little clip, but what I like about this clip is that it gets at something I love about digital color grading. And so this was scanned. It was shot on color film stock, actually. Scanned, desaturated to match the rest of the film, which was shot in black and white film stock, except for the one coat, the one red coat. And so you get this selective color effect. But I can't help but think that this resembles in many ways the thing we were talking about during our first class. Which is early silent film stenciling, right? To me, this feels like in sort of autonomous color. And this gets at one element of the digital workflow that I would say is controversial, right? The idea that we can offload many more elements of the creative process to the editing stage, to post-production. In this case, the film Casanova, all these colors were generated in post-production, right? These were done with the stencil process. None of this was quote unquote intended on the day, although I'm sure that they intended to do some stenciling, but the actual execution of that stenciling, like what color is the fire versus what color is on the man's shirt, those were left to artists in post-production. And likewise, we are able to essentially turn the visual creative process in the modern age into a very non-linear thing, which I think we might say has led to this fix it in post mindset. But I would say it's tremendously exciting in many, many ways. And let's see some of those ways at some point. One of the, one second, I'm going to embarrassingly close Discord because it doesn't listen to my Macs. Do not disturb. One such kind of a forward-thinking movement in cinema was that of the kind of music video directors of the 90s, especially. One of my favorite examples of this kind of early digital intermediate color grading is from Outkast's Bombs Over Baghdad music video. I'll just play the first 20 seconds or so, and you'll probably immediately see what I mean.
Yeah, international underground thunderbounds when I stop the ground. Like a million elephants, a silverback orangutan. You can't stop the train. Who wants some? Don't come unprepared. I'll be there, but when I leave there, better be a household name. Brother man telling us it ain't gonna rain. So now we sitting in a drop top soaking wet.
Pretty cool for 2000. And this brings to mind something I read in Richard Mishek's book, Chromatic Cinema, which is that perhaps the most significant characteristic of digital color is its partiality to transformation. In digital space, all colors carry the possibility of all other colors. Digital color is itself a variable, and I think we can see that in the color of everything from the ground to the grass in these scenes, right? I love the purple grass, because in the celluloid world, that grass is always going to be green. The only way we can make it not green would be to engage in some really experimental filtration. But in the digital space, the green in that grass carries with it the possibility of being purple. It's all data that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. In this case, it's a basic hue rotation that they have selected out that grass and gone, let's rotate you almost 180 degrees around the hue curve. And so, so the digital world is immensely freeing. This began to, I think, substantially affect what we might call the look of feature films In the very late 1990s, and especially in the early 2000s, we can see a film that is very close to being the first full DI, but kind of isn't on a technicality, and that's Pleasantville. So Pleasantville was entirely shot on color film stock, and the opening and the closing are finished photochemically in the present. They are presented in full color in a way that essentially respects what that film stock looked like. In the case of the in-universe television show scenes like this, which is 90% of the film, a digital intermediate was used to desaturate almost everything, less and less so though, as the town starts to regain its color, right? In this case, color is used as a metaphor for progress. And so every single one of these shots was digitally scanned in 2K and then reprinted back to film. And you can see some of the little jagged edges of early digital color grading here. In the shots that combine black and white and color, we have, you can see some fairly, I think, gnarly skin tones on McGuire and Jeff Daniels here, right? Like their faces are, there's a kind of almost an uncanniness to that kind of pinkness of their skin. And that is a byproduct of the fact that this was scanned in 1998 and heavily, heavily manipulated. I think, too, the kind of opposition that we talked about, especially in the first two talks, about the cultural associations with black and white and color, how in the early to mid-century, they kind of flipped, right? During the Technicolor era, black and white was considered the naturalistic way to shoot, right? It was considered, if you're going to do a regular old film, you shoot in black and white, and you need an excuse to shoot in color, right? One, because it cost money, two, because it was the exception. Sometime in the late 50s and to mid 60s, this gradually started to turn, and black and white became the affectation. In the digital era, black and white and color, when processed digitally, can contain one another. In this case, a full color film, this film was shot entirely in color, contains a black and white film. And so this wall came crashing down, and this led to a tremendous amount of aesthetic implications. We even saw photochemically finished films imitate the kind of the trends of the digital color era. This is from the Wachowskis' The Matrix. And as you can see, all the real world quote unquote scenes at the bottom are tinted in this very, very blue way. All the scenes within the Matrix are, and I want to also asterisk here, this home video release that I've taken stills from does way play up the green in the actual film prints. It's a lot more subtle. But all of these gestures, which still exist, were done totally photochemically. These were using simple red, green, blue printer lights. This was a photochemically finished film. Now, a pretty high percentage of it underwent a digital intermediate, but the majority of the film was in fact never touched a digital scanner, which is kind of shocking to think of now, considering how many VFX shots are in the film. A major touch point in this conversion to a sort of a digital intermediate workflow as the dominant one was Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, shot by Roger Deakins and directed by the Coen brothers. It was the first major film in terms of the first film that cost a significant amount of money, new release film, non-restoration, to be given a full digital intermediate. And the reasoning was actually very pragmatic. Roger Deakins and the Coen brothers did not go into this project thinking, yeah, we're going to do the first full DI of a first run major film, so many asterisks. But they arrived at it after doing a lot of photochemical tests that failed. Here was their challenge. They wanted to shoot in Mississippi in the rainy season in a way that looked like the Dust Bowl era drought. And Mississippi in the rainy season in the year 2000 is really green, it turns out. And so they tried bleak bypassing, they tried pre-flashing the film, didn't work. So Deakins turned to a radical experimental color grade. And I've actually clipped a couple minutes from the a now out of print DVD special feature that I found where Roger walks us through the process. And in doing so, actually illuminates a lot of the early challenges of the DI and the aesthetic implications that these challenges had. So let's listen for a second.
For 100 years now, post-production for live-action movies has largely been the domain of the film laboratory. All sorts of photochemical processes have been used over the years to create the final look of a picture. When it came to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, filmmakers Joel and Ethan Cohen and director of photography Roger Deakins decided to depart from convention. For the first time, the look of an entire live-action feature was manipulated digitally.
The major challenge of this picture was the final look.
Roger Deakins and the Coen brothers approached us while they were in the pre-production stage of the movie. They had an idea of what they wanted to see on the film. They didn't know how to get to that vision.
So we wanted to look, very dry and dusty and have a sort of feel of an old picture book.
Before Roger came to CineSite, he had already spent about 3 weeks at a lab using photochemical processes, various different types of photochemical processes, to try and get the look he wanted.
Conventional lab work actually is fairly restricting. I mean, you've got 3 primary colors you can balance between, a red, green and blue. So you've got 3 color separation. Basically, you're stuck with the balance between the 3 primary colors. When they were talking about this picture, and they were talking about this Dust Bowl era sort of look, and so then became this whole issue how to alter the image enough to get the look they wanted. Let's go in Mississippi. They said, oh, okay, well, when are you shooting? And they said June, July. I said, well, it's going to look just like Ireland. It's not going to look like dry and brown and dusty.
The way the digital intermediate process works is to take the film negative after it has been conformed. In other words, it's all been cut together, all the shots are in the right order. We bring it into here and we put it on what's called a data cine. And that data cine takes the film and it transfers it into a digital format. While that's happening, we are also color grading every shot in the film. To do that, we use what's called a color corrector, and the colorist is somebody who basically works with color. So the client may, whether it be Roger Deakins or someone else, may say, can you make that more red? The colorist can make it more red. He can take someone's face and change the color of the face. He can take a shirt and change the color of the shirt. He can really go in and adjust very carefully the elements in the image. Once the whole film has been assembled on the digital workstation, then we record it back out to film again using a laser film recorder. And that's where we merge in with the traditional process again. The film goes to the lab, it's developed, a print is made, the cinematographer looks at the print, decides that he likes it, and then multiple prints are made which go to the movie theaters.
Now, because we knew we were going to come into digital suite, we actually shot a very clean negative. And of course the joke is that Joel and Ethan never want to see the film printed in color from the original negative, because they saw one shot and they were just like so appalled, because it's just the antithesis of what we were wanting to achieve. But in order to have the control digitally, you wanted those saturated colors so you could actually select them later on in as a digital image.
Let's see if this, use the other selector, there we go. And so that brings us to another major milestone in the development and popularization of digital intermediates, and that's Amelie, directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet, shot by Bruno Dubanel, who has been consistently one of the most forward-thinking cinematographers in the world as far as digital futzery, we can call it. My friend Troy, cover your ears, kids. My friend Troy is trying to popularize the phrase pixel fucking. But digital intermediates allow, in this case, Dubanel and Jean-Pierre Jeunet to achieve a lot of different kind of nuances that weren't possible with simple filtration. This was still a transitional work in many ways, Dubanel has later gone on to say, because he still used a few filters. He didn't go the Roger Deakins route, he didn't shoot a clean negative, he used warm filters virtually the whole film. But then he would use the digital intermediate to kind of rescue tones and to emphasize them. At the top here, you see the dailies grade, which basically means the color grade that was done, usually the day of shooting or the day after they shot a certain scene. It's rough, it's called a one light, so each shot isn't really given the special care, and it's illuminating. You can see in the top left corner things like the foreground salad tongs and is that watermelon? They're kind of a dull red, but in the final grade they pop. They've been, the effect of the warm filter has been reversed. Same with Audrey Tauto's green shirt. On the right, you can see the colors in the gnome, the colors in the leaves, and the blue in the sky have been kind of retained by careful hue selection. And this is not possible with traditional filters. One of their central inspirations was I'm going to bring down the name here, of was a Brazilian painter named Juarez Machado, and his kind of use of kind of discordant colors, the bright blue of the dress there contrasted with the bright red, both of which kind of stand out among the general warm tone of everything in this painting. So in a very real way, this allowed them to kind of imagine an unreal color scheme. And this went beyond simple color grading. Notice how in post-production, Jean-Pierre Jeunet realized that they had no countertone in these shots of Amelie at home. So they digitally added lamps to these shots as an excuse to have a blue counterpoint. So this extended beyond mere color grading. They're, again, part of the wonder of digital to me is that color grading, visual effects, design, shot design become a nonlinear thing. If you have a good idea at any stage in the process and it's workable, the bandwidth, the possible tools we have to execute those are wider than ever. Here's a little, I dug this up from another old release, and here's a little short clip of Bruno Delbonnel and Jean-Pierre Jeunet describing their workflow. And they use a term here that I'm going to be using later called power windows. And that basically means a little rotoscope you draw within the frame that applies a color grade to part of the frame, but not all of it. And this is, I think, the first time I've ever heard that term used. And this is recorded in the year 2001.
There is one shot which is kind of obvious, in which we work a lot on the grading. It's a master shot where you have the grocery store just at the angle of the street. In the final grading, we made a power window just on the grocery store, just to enhance the color of the grocery store, so the eye goes directly to the center of the frame like that. And there is another one which is in the subway. We enhance the green as well when she's walking in the passageway, in the stairway and everything. And we enhance really the green on that one.
And so as you can see, they're essentially shooting with a certain look in mind, but leaving every tool imaginable at the time on the table to execute that look and deepen it. Jean-Pierre Jeunet's major issue with his previous film, Delicatessen, was that the kind of imperfectness, the blunt instrumentness of the photochemical workflow didn't allow him the leeway to kind of perfect the images the way he wanted. Although, a funny thing I discovered was that by shooting on location, he was also displeased with Amelie in some ways because he wasn't able to control every part of the location, which is fun. But if we compare these shots here to equivalent shots, not equivalent, but like somewhat similar palette-wise shots in the main from something like the film we're going to discuss in 3 weeks, the Double Life, actually this is a short film about killing, which is the Kieslowski film we're not going to show because it's a big downer. Notice how the red tones in the top left and the bottom right image are not actually red. They are less green than what's around them. They're not this pure popping red. They only appear red because they are the opposite of green. In Amelie, the reds truly stand out, and the purity of those reds is retained, and this is due to very careful digital color manipulation in post-production. So Delbonnel is able to achieve a much more kind of punchy, poppy color contrast in a way that Sławomir Itchek and Kieślowski were not able to, nor would they have wanted to, likely. I don't think that if the red jacket of the man in the top left had popped, it would have felt at home in this rather downer movie. You can see the difference there, right? You have the true red on the right versus the very dull pseudo red, which is closer to a gray actually, on the left. Speaking of digital intermediates, I want to talk about digital intermediate hell for a second here, and the implications this has for the look of these movies going forward, which I think does matter. This is a shot from the awful, awful, awful Blu-ray release of The Big Lebowski, finished photochemically. It was the Coen brothers' last film finished photochemically. Here's a screenshot from the new-ish 4K release that is really terrific. Notice how the colors are very different, but notice how the texture of the image is significantly improved, right? That's because this does not, the old release does not actually represent the texture of the original film. This is a bad scan handled badly in post-production. This is a very accurate scan that has been supervised by Roger Deakins personally to reflect the look of the film as it was released photochemically in cinemas. You can see that again here. Old Blu-ray, modern 4K presentation, right? And having seen the 35mm film, this is significantly closer to how the film looks. And so photochemical workflows allow for this kind of return to the source material. You can't do that with early digital intermediates. Here's the 2001 Sony release, or the Lionsgate release of Amelie. Get ready for a shock. Here's the 2021 Sony release of Amelie. Amelie was mastered digitally. The official files that Bruno Delbonnel, Jean-Pierre Jeunet intended for the film are 2K digital files scanned in 2001. The original negative exists, but it's an artifact. To actually, quote-unquote, restore the film, you would have to go back to the negative, rescan it, and then reapply all the many, many filters, digital filters and color grades that Delbonnel applied. One, that's expensive, and two, as Delbonnel and Roger Deakins have both independently kind of suggested, the look of 2000s digital intermediates, meaning that kind of splotchiness, notice how the highlights are clipping on that windmill? You know, you get that windmill is behind here is bright white and it just, the film grain disappears. That is just a part of how this movie looked when it came out. So they want to respect that. So there's an interesting little historical question here of how we treat, do we treat the digital intermediate version of this as the canonical one? Or do we treat the negative that ended up, you know, being turned into this digital intermediate as the version to retain? So it's we're getting into the question of, you know, back that we, you know, posited in our first talk of what is film? What is a film? What is the actual factura of it? Speaking of digital color grading and its aesthetic implications, as Richard Mishek in his book also posited, these tools encouraged a certain aesthetic rhyme between many films released at the era. These include everything from The Matrix to The Lord of the Rings to Band of Brothers. He calls it digital monochrome. And this is a very simple way to deal with the DI. You essentially desaturate the image and push it in a certain hue direction, right? In this case, you see 4 different scenes of Lord of the Rings, all shot fairly monochromatically, pushed in 4 different directions, right? Top left, push blue, top right, push in a kind of neutral warm. And this was a very common chromatic style of the early to mid 2000s. And I can't help but think it actually resembles both in terms of the workflow, in that these were decisions largely made in post-production or enacted in post-production, with the way that silent film tinting works, right? Silent film tinting is generally, decisions made in post-production. When Abel Gance was shooting Napoleon, he wasn't thinking necessarily, this scene will be purple, this will be orange. Those were decisions largely offloaded to the editing stage. And this applies to Lord of the Rings, it applies to something like Band of Brothers too, which has a particularly interesting way of dealing with this. The amount of color range in the image, the saturation, is greatly attenuated depending on where our company of soldiers is, and when in the war we are depicting, right? Throughout the series, we get further and further desaturated until the war ends, and suddenly we get this kind of relative explosion of color in the bottom right corner when they're relieved of duty and they get to hang out in Austria for a week. So early kind of DI cinema really was full of these interesting color contrasts. It's also worth noting, though, that all of these kind of tools still remained kind of within the vernacular of photochemical finishing. Does anyone here know the process that they were trying to replicate with this low saturation? Bleach bypassing, which is a photochemical process that results in a lower saturation and higher contrast. This is based off of Saving Private Ryan and Janusz Kaminski's kind of really groundbreaking execution of that workflow. But when you're shooting a 10-hour TV series for half the amount of money, bleach bypass is not necessarily as feasible. So this was all done digitally. This is a digital facsimile of a photochemical process. And throughout the 2000s, 2010s, we saw a variety of trends emerge due to digital intermediates and the possibilities that opened up from them. Things like the quote-unquote dreaded teal and orange look, where hues in many popular films were compressed into complementary colors of teal and orange. And I've dug up an old shot I have of Mona Lisa that has been color graded to look teal and orange as a way of illustration. Again, this is a look that is in vague ways rooted in the way that photochemical film stocks can kind of emphasize the teal and orange parts of the spectrum, but it's been blown up. It's been turned into a kind of a parody of itself. We also see you might want to turn down the spotlight for this one. We also see the kind of advent of a very, I think the fact that 3 of these screenshots are totally illegible shows my kind of point here. The way that we can manipulate digital images in far more extreme ways, especially on the edges of the chrominance scale, has allowed filmmakers to make unprecedentedly dim movies, dark movies, which is another trend. Not made, again, this is not a trend that has been made inevitable by digital intermediates, but it's a trend that is made possible by digital intermediates. The same technology that leads to, Amy Adams being invisible in the top right is what can lead, Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox to be bright as the sun on the bottom left, right? So technology does not make aesthetics inevitable, it just makes them puts them into the deck of cards you can pull. Del Bonnell himself went on to kind of expand upon, I'm going to mute this, expand upon his own kind of work in Amelie with films such as, I really love his works with Alexander Sakharov, but probably his most high-profile film that kind of expands upon these techniques is something like Inside Llewyn Davis, which was shot on 35mm film stock, but totally clean. They used no filters or softening filters or even color filters on the film set. In post-production, however, they massively manipulated the colors of the image and softened them. There's a lot of blooming. Notice how everyone appears to glow, entirely done in post-production. They also removed the blue channel from the image and then filled in that data with the other 2 color channels, giving it this almost 2-strip Technicolor look. Right? And so the film is full of these kind of slightly uncanny, almost, it feels like a faded photograph that has since been color corrected. And this is a very intentional, set of decisions designed to make this essentially look entirely like the cover of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, turned into a motion picture. I'm going to open DaVinci Resolve for a second here and talk about the kind of dematerialization that occurs when color grading becomes a possibility. So these are all shot digitally because that's how I shoot. But let's actually turn off the spotlight for now, and that way we can see it. Thanks. But one of the great things about, to me, digital color is that we can essentially digital imagery, and I include film, shot on film, and then scanned, which becomes digital, is inherently arbitrary. It has no fixed state. The fixed state of digital is a notepad document with a bunch of 1s and 0s on it, right? And so this frees us from the constraints of the photochemical workflow. Here is a shot. Actually, I'm going to go to this shot here because there's a lot of color in it. This is a shot we shot digitally a couple years back. And the intent with this particular shot was to essentially emulate a specific type of film stock that Gordon Willis used in the early 70s. But we could just as easily interpret this as a basic digital image. And then, for example, so this is just the image given a transform so that it, in a technical way, looks the way the camera manufacturer intended it to look. But just as easily, I can open up a saved color grade here and emulate using a series of like 30 operations the entire photochemical workflow. These first 5, let's call them layers, but they're called nodes up here. Actually, it's more like the first 15 layers are all emulating the kind of photochemical workflow of Kodak Vision 2 500T negative film stock. And so if I make a change to the gain early on, I can basically recreate the impact of changing my aperture and exposure and white balance on the day of filming. And so I can ask myself, okay, what if I underexposed this by 2 stops on the day, which I didn't, I overexposed it by 2 stops. And what if it was also kind of a dim evening and the light in the foreground was more blue? Well, I can recreate that in a fairly accurate way by just adding a bunch of, I added too much green here and missed my control surface. There we go. I can darken it by 2 stops and you can see a little before and after there. I'm essentially, by paying attention to a recreated celluloid workflow, able to recreate the photochemical workflow. And again, if we take that as an example, and we go back to the basic Rec 709 transform, which basically means, what if we didn't bother with the photochemical part? You can see that this is kind of how the camera wants to see the image. This is how we force it to see it, right? And by doing this, we can even, for example, we can change film stocks. I can instead open up a, what if we shot it on Fujifilm, right? There, right? We can digitally change film stocks by being aware of our chain of signal in post-production. And this opens up many possibilities. I don't quite have time to spend the 10 minutes it would take to like totally relight one of my shots. But we can do everything from, okay, let's pick a different film stock in post-production. Let's change the exposure in post-production. As long as we have the requisite data to do that, we are able to essentially rewrite the story of how the film was made on a technical level in post-production now. Here's the thing though, I think the knock against that workflow tends to be, oh, you're just fixing it, you're being indecisive on the day, you're fixing it in post. But the way I like to think of this workflow, the digital workflow, is that of a non-linear creative process. In the example of this film here, it was a very fun kind of process because we were able to, in pre-production, before the film was shot, take out a camera, shoot a bunch of tests, and knock together a bunch of looks in this program. And then decide upon, okay, we're going to more or less make it look like this, right? We're going to use this fake photochemical process to enact a look upon the sensor data. And then what we did was we just, on set, had a bunch of monitors that had this process built into it so we could look at what the process did live and shot with that in mind. So we were able to make everything from production design decisions to lighting decisions with that in mind. And you can kind of see the results here. And I like showing this clip here because I can speak to it with more accuracy than other people's work. But as you can see here, for example, on the day, we had a blue car that we didn't like the hue of, so we rotated the hue later in post-production because we couldn't afford to repaint it. So that's kind of strategic BS in post-production to better enact look. We didn't shoot under green, nasty fluorescent lights, but we did offset the camera in post-production to look like that the lighting in that room was green and nasty. We made sure to retain all the detail in those highlights there by not overexposing too much, so that after the color grade, we could still see out those windows. So it wasn't just this blank thing, right? And like this, we shot this neutral, but we made it sunset in post-production. But we shot with that in mind, so we knew, for example, okay, what color tone should her uniform be in that moment? Little things like that allow us to essentially plan on finishing our creative process in post-production. And that gets to me to the thing we started out with 5 weeks ago, for those of you who have our season pass to this talking series. The difference between the material that your film is physically made of, the factura, right, the film stock, the physical thing I can hold, and the dematerialization of that, which is what you're seeing projected on the screen right now, right? And so when we're making cinema, unless we're an avant-garde artist who is doing installation work, in which case that's amazing, live your best life. But if you are making cinema with the intent of projecting it on a screen, I think that the dematerialization, the dematerialized form of that, the light that's projected on the screen due to a series of technical processes that go into it, how we get there in the digital era is more arbitrary than ever. And there are so many paths that we can choose, and that's what's freeing to me about the digital workflow, is that we can kind of write our own photochemical workflow, or we can write our own totally different workflow. And so we've kind of hit that kind of, I think, point of even further dematerialization, where I do not feel any tied at all to the question of, are we shooting on film or digital? Are we, how are we getting there? It's all a means to an end, now more than ever, which I think is actually pretty cool. So, 2 pieces of housekeeping. One, Tom already mentioned this, but if anyone wants to see the thing I've been working on for the past 5 years, we're playing it at VIFF on October 3rd. In this very room, here's the pro tip. If you want the good sound, sit right in the middle. And then we have Double Life for Veronique on October 7th. It's a terrific film, and there's a beautiful new restoration out that we're gonna show. And then I'm gonna talk all about filtration, which is gonna be a lot of fun. And lastly, if anyone wants a space to talk about film, I do run a Discord server. So for those of you for whom Discord makes sense, feel free to look at this QR code. If you don't know what Discord is, please ignore everything I'm saying. But I want to say, I think I have time for a couple questions. Do I have time for a couple questions? Cool. But first, before I do questions, I want to say thank you so much for joining me on this 4, kind of 5, it's going to be 5 in 3 weeks series. You've been a lovely audience this whole time, and it's been an immense pleasure. So thank you so much. We got our first question right there in the center, and then, so actually, Tom, you're near our fellow in the back with the microphone, then we'll go dead center.
Okay, I love Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, and especially the look they had. But maybe you can clear something up for me. I understood that when they shot the first rushes, they were so colorful and didn't sort of emulate what they wanted with the Second World War, that they actually took the lenses and ground off all that incredible filtration that those lenses had before they reshot. You mentioned the bleaching process. Did they do both, or am I under some wrong impression?
They did both. They bleached the film and also used specially designed lenses and cameras to further degrade the image.
Thank you.
It was all of the above. Kaminsky is maybe my favorite living DP because he's so wacky.
Thank you. I understood some of your material, but certainly not all. But I guess I was caught by, do you think, you mentioned about there was that scene with the car that you said it would have been too expensive to paint the car, and it was way easier. And so is that the issue now, that they use digital to save lots of costs, because they can do lots of changes without really, like you say, repainting a car or something like that?
It's always a very good question. To me, because film is naturally, every film has a finite budget, unless your name is like Michael Cimino and it's 1980. And so every single film is a balancing act between what you can afford and what you want, right? And so if there's if we were to repaint the car, could we have gotten a shot that was like 0.5% more chromatically coherent with like a tiny couple artifacts that weren't there? Sure, but in terms of the actual cost benefit, I think our budget for that short film was $70,000. It would have taken about 2% of our budget to paint that car twice. So we're like, okay, do we want to do that, or do we want to afford like better food for the actors? And food won out. We have time for one more? Do we have one more? All right, I'll take that as, question there.
Do I need microphone?
You had to shout.
Okay, if I wanted to start color grading, is it bad to start without having a proper screen because of not like getting the exact colors?
That's a very good question. So step one, get a TV with filmmaker mode. Put it on filmmaker mode, you'll get 95% of the way there. And then eventually, there's a whole this all ends with buying a $20,000 Flanders scientific monitor, which nobody wants. But if you basically get a good TV that's, especially if it's like an OLED, that can do filmmaker mode, and then you calibrate it with a probe. That's the hard part, but if you can do that, you basically got a good setup for color grading. Yeah. Also, close all your windows, turn off all your lights. All right. I think that's about.
Okay, so let's go with a round number and say we'll start the movie at 2 o'clock then. It's 10 to 2 right now. Thank you, Devin.
All right, thank you so much. All right, I'm going to unplug this. I hope it... That was fun.
That was very good. It's like, I think